Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I also want to mention that the film has a US distributor, Strand Releasing. I want to thank them for working with us on the festival and also mentioning that we will open the film in June. So the movie will be brought back to a larger audience. But you can come back several times. You're always allowed. It's difficult movie to talk about, even so there's a lot to say, reflecting on the time, but also, as you mentioned in your introduction, it's a very interesting time we're living now, which bring you to reflect when some people are able to reflect. You two have worked together for quite a while. But I was curious to know at what point you decided to adapt this book from Elizabeth, and when you decided to turn it more into a fiction approach as opposed to, maybe more documentary style, and how the collaboration and the discussion were at that point when you were starting.
C'était pour moi. Bon, j'ai travaillé pour la première fois sur le livre d'Elizabeth Becker, When the War Was Over, en 97, 96, 97, 94.
Le premier fois quoi?
Oui, oui.
Sur Popana?
Oui. Oui, vers là, 94, 95, voilà. Je vous laisse traduire.
I first worked on Elizabeth Becker's book when the war was over around 1994, 1995.
Je m'en souviens pas très bien, j'ai la mémoire qui flanche. Et c'était l'histoire d'une jeune femme. Surtout, c'est l'histoire de la manière dont elle résistait contre le régime des Khmer Rouges, par exemple en écrivant des lettres d'amour à son mari révolutionnaire, dont elle a été attrapée puis exécutée à cause de leur amour, quoi. C'est comme si un message pour dire, voilà, vous pouvez tout me prendre, tout contrôler, sauf ce qui est au profond de moi, c'est l'amour, vous ne pouvez pas le prendre. Donc voilà, c'est quelque chose comme ça. Et je trouvais cette histoire intéressante de faire connaître. C'est sur Wopana, dont Elisabeth était la première à mettre la lumière sur le dossier.
I don't remember exactly about the date. My memory is giving out on me a little bit, but it was the story of a young woman who had resisted the Khmer Rouge regime by writing love letters to her revolutionary husband, and eventually they were both caught and executed because of this. But the message that she was sending with these letters was that you can take everything from me and try to control it except what is deep inside of me. And that is a story that I thought was interesting to share, and Elizabeth was the first to shed light on this case.
Et puis dans son livre, il y a le fameux chapitre 13, dont Elizabeth parlait de son voyage pour aller interviewer Pol Pot à la veille de la chute du régime des Khmer Rouges, en décembre 1978. Et la chute des Khmer Rouges, c'est le 7 janvier 1979. Et voilà, ce chapitre reste dans ma tête depuis quelques années déjà. Et puis voilà, un jour, parfois vous avez une idée, vous n'êtes pas prêt de le faire. Et donc, il faut laisser le temps de maturation, qui grandisse dans votre tête. Et voilà, à un certain moment, vous vous sentez capable de le faire, c'est bon.
Then there was Elizabeth's book, and notably the famous chapter 13, in which she describes her trip to go interview Pol Pot right before the fall of the Khmer Rouge. She met him in December 1978, and the Khmer Rouge fell on January 7th, 1979. And this chapter had stayed in my head for years. So sometimes you have an idea, but you're not quite ready to act on it yet. You need to give it time to mature and to grow in your mind, and then at a certain point, you feel ready.
Thank you. I'm not sure everyone knows who Rithy Panh is, so I'm going to embarrass you. Rithy was in Cambodia in December 1978 when I was there. He was an emaciated teenager who, in the killing fields of Cambodia, had already lost his parents and half his siblings. So this man is the equivalent of Anne Frank, if she had survived the Holocaust, and then become the director who solidified the memory of the Holocaust in film. So this is a man whose experience, as well as who he is very responsible for what you felt as the authentic experience. And this is part of what's between us. And his interest in women, I appreciate, of course, because the reason I found Bopana's dossier, which is in fact the confession she wrote because she was tortured and executed by the Khmer Rouge, I went to the Tuol Sleng Execution Center, which is now a museum, in the very early days, and I looked for a woman who I might have known when I lived in Cambodia. And after some search, I found that dossier. And when a young man from Paris called me in 1994, 1995, and asked about that because he was thinking of film, I was so happy because he's the first person who even noticed it. I had wonderful reviews for the book, but Rithy was the one who noticed it. And of course, he noticed it because he went through it. So this is who the director is. When he told me that it was going to be all fiction, he was changing my name. I was no longer American. I was older. There was no longer 2 American journalists and 1 British academic. It would be 3 French and 1 photographer. To tell the actual story, and I don't expect you all to know, we were 2 American journalists and 1 British academic, and the Khmer Rouge did kill the British academic, and I did hide in the bathtub, and that all happened, and we did go through more or less what Rithy said, had thrown in. So he was true to the story, even though he made it fiction, if that makes sense. And I couldn't have asked for another more wonderful actress than Irène Jacob to play me. So, merci beaucoup.
Merci. Moi, j'ai fait des vacheries à elle. J'ai rien montré du tout. Rien. Elle a découvert le film pendant la projection au Festival de Cannes. Et déjà, quand on montre un film en public, on a la trouille. Alors on est là, on regarde qui sort pas de la salle, tout ça. Et là, en plus, j'ai elle à côté de moi. J'arrête pas de me regarder comme ça. J'ai pas vu les débuts du film. Et au début, elle était comme ça. Elle dit, oh là, elle devait être pas contente. Puis petit à petit, elle était absorbée par le film. Elle dit, bon, je peux regarder le film maintenant. Tout va bien. Et je dis, bon, c'est chaud.
So thank you. You know, I made my images, and I didn't show her anything. She discovered the film at its screening at the Cannes Film Festival. And you know, it's already scary enough when you show a film in public the first time. You're looking at who's going to leave, who's staying in the screening room. And on top of that, I had her next to me. So I couldn't even watch the film at the beginning. You know, I was looking at her and she was kind of looking like this, and I was like, oh, she's not happy. And then little by little, she seemed to get absorbed. And then I was like, phew, I can watch the film.
So it's really interesting to see that you decided to make into a fiction film, and you're very lucky to have also a wonderful cast like Irène Jacob and Grégoire Colin to portray this semi-fictional character, since it's sort of changed. But But you also mix some, you know, like material that are very true to your way of working. And I'm thinking particularly of the way you use the puppets. That was a crucial part of the missing image. And how you bring it back in here in a different context, but bringing all these emotions. Can you talk a little bit about your decision process in putting this in the film, how it was reflected from the book and from your experience?
Elisabeth va me taper.
Elizabeth is going to hit me.
Je dois dire la vérité, quand j'ai décidé de faire le film, j'ai pas relu son livre. J'ai dit que c'est le boulot de le scénariste. C'est lui que... Mais j'ai une parfaite mémoire de ce chapitre 13, que ça fait des années que ça circule. Parce que je me disais qu'il faut que j'oublie certaines choses, je retienne l'essentiel peut-être. Et de toute façon, je n'ai pas de moyen de faire tout ce qu'elle fait, quoi. C'est des visites des différents endroits, tout ça. Il faut que et voilà, à chaque fois que je la vois, j'essaie de lui expliquer que, tu sais, le scénario... Je n'ai pas trop parlé de scénario. Vraiment, merci beaucoup, Elisabeth, de m'avoir laissé faire de cette histoire, ce film. Mais je crois que j'avais besoin de liberté, en fait. J'ai besoin d'un... la forme du film, il est dicté par ce besoin-là. Ça peut être aussi besoin d'argent, manque d'argent, tout ça, mais moi, je prends les choses comme comment dire, quand je vois une difficulté qui arrive, je dis, oui, c'est embêtant, mais c'est peut-être une chance. Donc, j'essaie de créer autre chose à partir de ce moment-là, et à partir de cette difficulté-là, j'essaie de surmonter en apportant quelque chose de très important qui s'appelle le cinéma. En fait, c'est les solutions cinématographiques, c'est le son de montage, c'est la solution de... Et ça va bien dans ma philosophie parce que, bon, je ne peux rien enlever de mon histoire. J'ai vécu cette période difficile, je l'ai vécue et j'essaye de négocier avec et vivre avec. Mais une chose que j'y tiens absolument, c'est que ce n'est pas un film sur les Khmer Rouges, quoi. C'est un film, c'est un cinéma. Donc à chaque fois, quand je fais un film, même si c'est le sujet qu'on porte sur une période difficile de ma vie, il faut qu'il y ait une dimension cinématographique nouvelle, soit dans ces films-là. C'est vachement long, hein. J'ai oublié.
I must say the truth and admit that I decided when I made this film not to reread Elizabeth's book. I felt that was the screenwriter's work, and also I had a perfect memory of chapter 13 because it had been turning around in my head for years. And I think that it was important for me to remember certain things and to keep the essence of what it does. Of course, I knew that in a film I couldn't do everything that she does in the book, visiting different places and so on. And so each time I saw Elizabeth, I would say, well, you know, a screenplay is and so on. And, you know, really I have to thank Elizabeth for letting me tell her story and make this film. But I needed freedom. And so the form that the film takes is, I think, the expression of that need for freedom. Of course, it could also relate to lack of money, but the way I see it is that if there's a difficulty in making a film, well, that's a shame, but it might also be an opportunity. You know, I like to create something from a difficulty and overcome it with the contribution of that very important thing that is cinema. So I find solutions that are purely cinematic, that are editing, and that's really key to my philosophy of filmmaking. I can't take away my history. I can't put it aside. I certainly did live through that difficult moment in history, and I have to try to negotiate with that myself. But the important thing that I always tell myself when I make a film is that the film is not about the Khmer Rouge. It is cinema. I'm making a film, and it may be dealing with a hard aspect of life, but the dimension of cinema has to be expressed in the film.
Can I say something? And well, the one thing that he did ask me about, which is in the very first part of the film, we were having lunch with Catherine Dussart, who I also want to thank somewhere. She's in the audience, the wonderful producer. We were having lunch, and Catherine asked me a question about something or other, and I said, oh, and the worst thing was they gave me a hatchet that was made from the brass from the American leftover armaments. And I tried so hard to lose it, and they always kept putting it back in my suitcase. That got in there. I just wanted to say that Rithy made this wonderful film for all of his reasons, but my favorite reason is that it's about journalists. And a lot of my friends here are journalists, have been journalists, work with journalists. And I can't think of a time when journalism is more important in this country. I can't remember a American president who's ever called journalists the enemy of the people. And I love this movie because you see lots of the boredom we had when we had to try to find something, the risks we had no idea we were taking, the scant rewards, the murder of one of us, we were threatened by them. And we end up writing articles, publishing photographs, and obviously it so affected me, I wrote a whole book. But think of that when you think of the problems and the threats to journalism today. And I hope this movie is seen by a larger audience because of this very strong message that the importance of journalists and the work they do, particularly in countries and regions of tyrants, of 21st century totalitarian leaders, and the threats. And without a free press, the other freedoms are threatened. So thank you, Rithy.
I mean, it's true. I mean, and it also, Rithy mentioned it when he did his introduction about reflecting on today's time where you have journalists and you have propaganda. And the vision that you show in the film, and it's also obviously coming from your work, is extremely important. And yes, we do hope that people here today and in the country can reflect on that as well, not just as a story in the time of something that's in the past, but something that's continuing and something that's never been more important for us today. Because without journalists, like, we believe in propaganda. So, thank you. If we want to go back to cinema, you also made a lot of choices in the way you're framing the story. And I'm thinking also about the cinematography and the aspect ratio of the film that is also something that's very strong when the way you see it as an audience member, because it really puts you in the past. And I wanted to hear a little bit about your decision on working this way, showing the film this way, and the relationship with your cinematographer.
Le génocide des Khmer Rouges, c'est un génocide sans images. Il y a très peu d'images. Donc, j'aurais aimé qu'on concentre notre regard sur l'humain, à travers ces trois journalistes, à travers chefs Khmer Rouge à travers les victimes dans le village. Et le questionnement, c'est qu'est-ce que c'est l'idéologie, qu'est-ce que c'est la vérité, qu'est-ce que c'est la manipulation, qu'est-ce que c'est le mensonge. Et le 4/3 me permet ça. Il y a plein de choses hors champ que vous, spectateurs, doivent faire un effort d'imaginer. Et donc, on peut amener le son, on peut amener la mise en scène, on peut amener pas la lumière, parce que c'est certainement naïf de ma part. Quand je pense que c'est plus large, plus on voit les paysages, on voit plus les humains. Donc, c'est un film de paysage, quoi. Comme le Cambodge est tout vert, tout joli, donc ça doit devenir exotique. La part de esthétique de paysage effacera peut-être le performant de l'acteur, de l'actrice qui est capable d'exprimer, qu'il faut porter. Et on a travaillé difficile, on a travaillé très dur. Et Irène, c'est une grande bosseuse, Irène Jacob. Puis je savais bien qu'ils s'échangeaient entre eux discrètement, sans me dire. Ils se faisaient des déjeuners, ils s'écrivaient des mails entre eux.
Irène
Oui, ils croient que j'étais naïf, que je ne sais rien. En fait, je sais très bien. Ils faisaient ça. Donc, non, donc c'est du travail pour le cinéma que j'aime. Et donc, ça me permet d'aller plus sur le visage, plus dans les yeux, plus dans la direction des lumières, parce que maintenant, la plupart du temps, on arrose des lumières, puis on filme, puis on verra, quoi. Mais donc, vous voyez, c'est parfois le manque de moyens. En fait, moi, j'aime bien retourner à la source du cinéma quoi, des années 60, 50, ça. J'aime bien. Même avant, quoi. Je suis un fan de Vertov. Je suis un fan de Vertov dans le sens où cette liberté de mettre la caméra où il veut, quoi. Voilà, ce soit là, il n'y a pas de chant contre chant, il n'y a pas de faux, on s'en fiche, de faux raccords ou pas. L'important, c'est que l'émotion tienne, que l'histoire est là, quoi. Et donc, je suis partisan de cette liberté-là. Donc, cette choix de Katia, c'est ça, c'est rendre invisible certaines choses, certains mystères autour qui permettent aux spectateurs d'imaginer.
Well, the Khmer Rouge genocide was a genocide with no images. There are very few images. And for this film, I wanted to focus our gaze on the human, on these three journalists, on the Khmer Rouge, on the victims in the village, and to really make people ask themselves, viewers, what is the truth? What is manipulation? What is a lie? And the 4:3 aspect ratio allowed me to do that by leaving a lot of things off screen and making you, the viewer, imagine things. And I can help with that with the sound, with the mise en scène, with the light. It may be naive on my part, but I believe that the wider the image is, the more you see the landscape and you lose track of the human. You know, in Cambodia, the landscape is very green and pretty. I think it perhaps would have been too exotic, and that the landscape would have aestheticized things and erased the performance of these actors who were expressing so much and worked very hard. You know, Irène Jacob is a hard worker, and I know that she and Elizabeth behind my back were working, you know, having lunches, sending emails. They think I don't know about this, but I know. It's work to make the kind of cinema that I like. I wanted to allow myself to go to faces, to eyes, to really direct the light. That's what I want to do most of the time now. You know, sometimes it's related also to the lack of means, but I like to return to the source, to 50s and 60s cinema, and even before that, to Dziga Vertov, for instance, who had the freedom to put his camera wherever he wanted. You know, there was, in Vertov, there's no shot, counter shot, there's no bad edits. He didn't care. What was important is getting the emotion across and getting the story across. And I'm really a champion of that kind of freedom. So the aspect ratio, I think, helps by making certain things invisible, by maintaining a degree of mystery and making the viewer imagine things.
To continue the cinema, the journalism, the other thing that Rithy captured is that journalists, even though they're seeing the same thing, don't see the same thing. And I've never seen that. We're either really bad or really good, but there were three of us, and we saw the same thing. We were taking all over the same places. The only interviews we had were the people they chose for us, just as Rithy showed. And believe it or not, we came up with very different responses. Now, Malcolm Caldwell was murdered, so that only left two journalists, myself and Richard Dudman of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He wrote what he saw. He wrote what was said in interviews. And he came across in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch saying, as far as what he'd seen, that the people had enough to eat, they had days of rest, and he did not believe that there were gross human rights violations. In the Washington Post, I wrote that I heard, naturally what we were told, but indirectly, and I didn't have all the clues that your journalist had, but because I'd lived there before, which he also put in, very much important for journalists, that I came away with a different response, that I believe there were gross human rights violations, and that you can't ignore the fact that everything that you lived for was gone. All the pagodas, all the temples, all the mosques, that there was no marketplace, there was no music, there was no dance, nothing. All they had was working day and night with meager food. I did not see any, none of us saw that. So two very different sets of articles, and we saw the same thing. And I don't think that's ever been captured, but all the journalists here know that they've covered the same beat with other people, and they can't believe that one person wrote one article and the other person the other article, which is called the free press. So thank you for that, too.
So it's interesting that you mentioned one of your secrets, which was you were in touch with Irène Jacob, more or less behind Rithy's back, more or less. Was she asking you specific questions that she couldn't get from your writing, or wanted she know more about the way you were thinking at the time to help her carry them and portraying someone close to you or different from you?
Well, she asked the questions that an actress would ask about journalism, first of all, to translate it. And I'd also, I lunched with Cyril, and they both didn't know, they thought that they didn't know about lobbying for visas and what it took to get there and why they were chosen. And they asked all those things that non-journalists would ask. But she also, she wanted to know my whole path. So Rithy you gave her a lot of freedom. And so she'd have all this freedom and she'd email me. And I sent her, I got to the point where I sent her, she wanted to know what it was like to testify before the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, which I did in 2015. And because she thought she could get some clues for that, because I was testifying about this very trip. So I sent her clips, videos from the testimony. That's how the hardworking Irène was. And then she'd say, so how did you feel? And da-da-da-da. So it wasn't so much it was the context that a non-journalist and a non-Cambodia aficionado would not have. And so it was her due diligence, I would say, rather than conspiracy.
I have so many more questions, but hopefully you'll be back. So, but I thought maybe we can open it up to the audience to hear more. We have microphones. Yes. So raise your hand. We have 2 microphones. There's someone here in the middle. There's only 1 microphone, sorry.
Hi. How do you think this story would have differed if it was shot in 2025 when instead of cameras with films, you had mini cameras, cell phones? You could have gotten the information out instantaneously, assuming that there was internet access or satellite phones and so on.
You really couldn't, because as Rithy said, there's no images. And this country was cut off as no modern country was cut off. There was literally, they insulated themselves from the world. You could not get a telephone, a cable, a letter, nothing went in. And one of the reasons it was so scary while we were there, we knew we were on our own, but no telephone, nothing. So the idea of all this extra, it couldn't have happened. The Khmer Rouge couldn't have happened. It would destroy the whole story.
Aujourd'hui, je crois qu'il y a même trop d'images. Il y a trop d'images. Du coup, cette image de crime de masse est banalisée, est devenue banale. Vous avez tout ça, vous avez des caméras téléphone, vous avez même le body camera. Tous les soldats ont maintenant une caméra, ils peuvent filmer toute la guerre que vous voulez. Mais après, ça passe dans les réseaux sociaux. Après, demain, c'est autre chose. C'est comme, voilà, c'est devenu comme un vidéo game. Et du coup, la vie, la mort, la douleur, pourquoi pour faire cette guerre, pourquoi pas? On ne sait pas. D'ailleurs, aujourd'hui, on ne sait pas pourquoi on se bat en Ukraine. C'était les Russes qui ont envahi l'Ukraine. Maintenant, c'est devenu les Ukrainiens qui font la guerre aux Russes au bout de 3 ans. C'est ça le retournement de la réalité, en fait. Voilà, la guerre, cette histoire en 2025, c'est récemment à ça. On peut dire que les victimes sont en train de tuer le bourreau, par exemple. On peut tout à fait, avec des images aujourd'hui, je peux faire tous les films que vous voulez, toutes sortes de films.
Today, I even think there are too many images. You know, images of mass crimes have become banal. You have all sorts of telephone cameras, body cams. You know, all soldiers have cameras now. You can film all sorts of war, and then the images go onto social networks, and the next day, there's something different. It's become a video game. But life, death, pain, why are we fighting this war? You know, today, for instance, why is there fighting in Ukraine? It initially was Russia invaded Ukraine. 3 years later, people are saying now Ukraine is attacking Russia. That's the way that reality can be flipped nowadays. That's what war is like in 2025. You could say that victims are killing the executioners. With the images that we have today, you can make all sorts of movies.
There's a question here, and the microphone is coming. Running, actually. Oh.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and allowing us to be in conversation with you. I have a question about how you, Rithy, had chosen to portray Pol Pot. We see the image of the painting first, and then later we see the man speaking to the journalist. So I'm very curious about your decision-making around that. And also for Elizabeth Becker, too. How did you choose to take care of language when writing about this person?
Pol Pot, Elisabeth peut vous raconter mieux que moi parce que je ne l'ai jamais rencontré. Elle l'a rencontré. Mais toutes les images qu'on a de Pol Pot, c'est plutôt un mec bien, dynamique, souriant, bien habillé, sympa. C'est le genre idéal. Voilà, c'est vraiment chouette. Et bon, voilà, soit vous, si vous êtes dans le biopic, vous pouvez faire un mec pervers, gentil, mais tuer tout le monde, tout ça. Mais moi, je ne me sens pas bien de faire ça. Et ça, c'est la première chose. Deuxième chose, les acteurs capables de jouer les dictateurs, il y en a très peu. Il y a Charlie Chaplin, peut-être. Et il y a peut-être Bruno Ganz dans Hitler. Et je ne sais même pas comment Bruno Ganz retrouve sa vie après. Sinon, c'est toujours un peu ridicule. Parce que c'est beaucoup plus complexe. En dictateur, c'est très complexe à jouer ou à incarner. Surtout à incarner. Donc moi, j'ai fait mon choix. Je dis, voilà, pour moi, c'est le mal, quoi. Donc il va rester dans l'ombre. Voilà, il ne mérite pas d'autre chose que de l'ombre. Voilà, c'est comme ça, c'est réglé, c'est fini, voilà.
Well, Elizabeth can tell you more about Pol Pot because I never met him. She did. But, you know, if you look at pictures of Pol Pot, he looks like a good guy. He's smiling, he's well-dressed, a nice guy, the perfect son-in-law, really cool, you know? And if you're going to make a biopic, you could make him a perverse guy, you know, the nice guy who kills everyone. But that didn't seem right to me. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there are very few actors who can play dictators. There was Charlie Chaplin, and then maybe Bruno Ganz when he plays Hitler. And even then, I don't know how Ganz returned to his normal life after doing that. Other than those two, people who play dictators are really ridiculous. Dictators are something very hard to embody. So I made my choice. For me, Pol Pot is evil. So he stays in the shadows. He doesn't deserve better than the shadows, and that's where he stays.
Et j'ai eu un acteur qui joue, j'ai fait de casting, un acteur, on a fait des costumes pour lui et tout ça. Et on fait les peintures, peinture à l'huile et tout, une peinture à l'huile, ça met 2 mois à sécher, quoi. Puis l'acteur qui est un ami, qui est parti, il ne veut pas jouer. J'ai perdu le gars quelques jours avant le tournage. Une raison de plus que Pol Pot reste dans l'ombre.
So we had an actor, you know, I did casting, we cast this guy, he had costumes and all of that, we made the oil paintings of him, those take 2 months to dry, and then this actor was a friend of mine and he left a few weeks before, he didn't want to do it, he left the shoot, so that was one more reason to keep Pol Pot in the shadows.
Yann troisième.
Yes.
There's a third reason. Can I tell them? Bien sûr. Rithy played Pol Pot. That's why he's in the shadows.
No, I will play Ho Chi Minh. Your Uncle Ho.
And the reason, to answer your question, I'm a journalist, so I described the whole atmosphere. It was set up in the old Governor General's palace on the Mekong in a very palatial atmosphere. He sat in a great chair in the hall like a king. He was extremely well dressed, tailored Mao suit, very well groomed. And this was part of the theater of propaganda, so that I had no image of what I thought he would look like, but I thought he would look like a monster or an evil man. And they made sure that that's not the man I saw when I walked in. I did, within 15, 20 minutes, I realized he was crazy. And that came from his whole message. We had given questions that he ignored, so there was no back and forth in that. And the Vietnamese were close to invading, and his whole message, which I think was the whole point of the trip, was to say that the Vietnamese were going to invade, that they didn't stand a chance against the Cambodians on their own, so they would have to call in troops from the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And I was so crazy, I turned to Richard Dudman and I said, did the translator just say Warsaw Pact? Because this insane image of Vietnamese going across the rice paddies with Polish tanks, it's crazy. And then he said, because of this, he wanted NATO troops to come to Cambodia and help the Cambodian army. And this went on for a couple hours. So that's the impression, and it was so crazy that the Post did not publish most of it at all. It was just so crazy.
And we did have a question in the front.
I think it's wonderful to see your film and to hear the two of you talking about this experience. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary now of the takeover of Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge. And having traveled there some, it's clear there's still some struggles to help young people know that it really happened. And I was wondering, in the casting of these young Khmer Rouge troops, how much did you have to teach them about their own history, or is it something that they well understood? I know in this country, if you ask a young person, what happened 50 years ago, it's going to be a struggle to answer that.
C'est très complexe parce qu'il y a des adultes, certains d'entre eux ont connu cette histoire, donc, ont vécu sous le Khmer Rouge, donc c'est assez compliqué pour eux de jouer les Khmer Rouge cette fois-ci. Comme Bon Hoc qui jouait le 4 ou tous ceux qui parlent français à peu près, sont des gens qui ont grandi sous le Khmer Rouge, quoi, qui ont étudié le français après ou avant. Donc c'est très difficile pour eux de revenir, mais je crois que pour les jeunes, c'est la direction d'acteur. N'importe quel gamin, vous donnez des armes, ça y est, ils sont dans le coup. Hein. C'est très difficile, c'est très facile. C'est pour ça aussi, il y a pas mal de Je suis prudent, j'essaye plutôt de le dire, ce qui ne sont pas les Khmer Rouges d'abord. Parce que quand vous donnez une arme à un enfant, tout de suite, il manipule très bien, quoi. Il peut jouer très vite le rôle. Ma difficulté pour moi, c'était, attention, c'est un jeu, là, hein. C'est du cinéma, c'est pas comme ça. Ils viennent, après, ils s'entraînent pour qu'il n'y a pas de problème avec des armes, parce que on n'a pas... Il faut que ce soit très sérieux avec les armes, que ce soit comme un outil de comédie, non pas quelque chose qu'on fait vraiment une arme de guerre, même si c'est une arme de guerre. C'est très compliqué, très dangereux à faire jouer en fait. Et puis voilà, 50e anniversaire pour moi c'est tous les jours. Hein. C'est 50e anniversaire. Pourquoi pas 30e, pourquoi pas 20e? En fait, la politique a toujours besoin d'un symbole, d'une date, c'est normal, commémoration, pour assembler tout le monde autour d'un événement, d'un souvenir, d'une mémoire. C'est très bien. Mais pour ceux qui ont vécu, les Khmer Rouges, c'est tous les jours. Il faut manger avec, dormir avec, chanter avec, vivre heureux avec. Un jour avec, un jour sans, et ainsi de suite. Mais c'est un travail nécessaire en même temps. Moi, j'y tiens pas à raconter l'histoire des Khmer Rouge. D'ailleurs, à cause du 50e anniversaire, je vais partir là bientôt, je vais me cacher. Que tout le monde veut me demander hey, tu ne veux pas parler. Et voilà, je ne suis pas à l'aise avec tout ça. Je ne suis pas à l'aise avec tout ça. Mais je travaillais très sérieusement depuis que je connais le cinéma. Je fais un centre au Pana que vous connaissez. J'ai formé les jeunes gens dont vous avez une étudiante qui était à votre université ici. Et, on a fait des films, on a fait des applications, par exemple une application qui s'appelle Khmer Rouge History, donc vous pouvez télécharger gratuitement. On a toute l'histoire des Khmer Rouges, on a des archives sonores, des archives films, des archives photographies, que ce soit Google ou Apple, vous pouvez télécharger gratuitement. Ça, c'est des travaux qu'on initie parce que je pense qu'il faut... C'est plus que montrer des morts. Le génocide, ça veut... Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire un génocide, quoi? Ce qui est plus important, c'est montrer l'intention du génocide. Comment on travaille, comment le génocide est possible. Là, vous êtes obligé de retourner à l'histoire, à la recherche, à l'accès à cette mémoire. C'est très important, l'accès aux archives. Il faut créer une possibilité. Et on a la chance, parce qu'aujourd'hui, on a l'outil qui est téléphone portable. Et donc, tout le monde, partout dans le monde, et au Cambodge, on peut lire, on peut apprendre.
Well, it's very complex. You know, some of the adults knew this story. They lived under the Khmer Rouge, and so it was hard for them to come and act in this film. And everybody who speaks French in the film, or the guy who plays the cadre, these are people for whom it was hard to come back and do this. With the young people, it really is just a question of directing actors. You know, you give a kid, any kid, a weapon, and they're into it. But I try to be very cautious. I try to say what the Khmer Rouge are not. You know, because if you give the kid, the Khmer Rouge gun, he's going to handle it just fine. One has to be very careful with a gun in cinema. You know, we trained to make sure that there would be no problem with the weapons. These are serious weapons, and we want them to be tools for acting and not weapons of war, though of course they are weapons of war. So that was complicated because these are dangerous things. As for the 50th anniversary, for me it's the 50th anniversary every day. You know, why not the 20th? Why not the 30th? Politics needs symbols, dates, commemoration to bring people all together around a memory. And that's all fine, but for those of us who lived through the Khmer Rouge, it happens every day. We eat with them, we sleep with them, we sing with them, we dance with them. We try to live happy with the Khmer Rouge, one day on, one day off. So I don't particularly want to tell or talk about the Khmer Rouge. In fact, with the 50th anniversary coming up, I'm going to go away and hide because everyone wants to talk to me about it. And I'm not at ease with all of that. But I have done a lot of work with cinema in this regard. As you know, I created a cinema center. We are training young people. There's a young woman who you know who's at your university here that was trained. And I've also participated in creating an app, KR History, c'est KR ou Khmer Rouge? Yeah, Khmer Rouge History. It can be downloaded free of charge, and you find all the archives of the Khmer Rouge. There's photos, there's sound, all of that is available all over the world. But, you know, more than showing the dead, one really needs to get at what a genocide means. I think it's more important to show the intention of genocide, to show how it was possible. And it's a good thing because now we can have these possibilities to access the archives through these tools. And that's it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you,
Merci.
Nicolas. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Accoutrement.